Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 283 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is John Crowley. He's the author of novels such as Engine Summer, The Egypt Sequence, and Lord Byron's novel. And his book Little Big is one of the most widely admired fantasy novels of the past few decades. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new novel Ka, Dar Oakley in the Ruins of Emer, about a crow who finds himself reincarnated throughout history. I also want to mention that during this interview, John mentioned several books that he read while researching Ka. And if you want the exact titles and authors of those books, I'll be listing them for you after the interview. And now, here's our interview with John Crowley. All right, so we're here with John Crowley. Welcome to the show.
Very happy to be here. Wired is a magazine that I've always enjoyed looking at.
Okay, so your new book is called Ka, Dar Oakley in the Ruins of Emer. So how'd this book come about?
Well, it's a little hard to describe how any book comes about, but I cared about crows and thought about crows and enjoyed thinking about crows for many, many years. I remember when I was a kid, I read a wonderful book by a writer named Alan DeVoe, now long forgotten, but he was a nature writer in the 1940s, and I learned from him that how smart crows are, and that crows can tell the difference between a man carrying a shovel over his shoulder and a man carrying a gun. And they know to stay away from the one, and the other one can't hurt them. I thought that was pretty remarkable. And then, of course, there's my name, which happens to have a crow in it. So both of those things tend me toward crowhood and crowdom in a big way. I had thought about writing a book about crows for a long time without actually being able to conceive how I would do it. All I thought of was a bunch of crows in the city, kind of like a gang of pirates or bandits somehow getting in squabbles with each other and making alliances and doing stuff. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And so when I finally decided, okay, it's time to start on this, most of the ideas I have for books begin some 10 years before I actually sit down and start working on them. I had to think of a framework that would hold enough amusement and entertainment for a book. And so I started thinking about crows and death. I had just read a wonderful book called The Dominion of the Dead. I can give you the name of the author. I can see the book, but I can't read the title, and I can't put down the phone to get it. But it's a wonderful book about burial and death and what death means and why people get buried and what their funerals mean to us. So I was thinking a lot about the dead, and the two things just came together to make this book.
And how about the idea that this was going to take place over 1,000 years or so? I can't tell you at what point in my thinking this really came to me. Is that Dar Oakley the crow would die and be born again and die and be born again. I think probably it came about because I thought of him going after this key to immortality with a human person, and that he would get it and not the human. But then I thought, now what? So I decided he'd sort of get it and then lose it, but it would still affect him in a certain way, so that even though he dies, he keeps coming back, which is a different kind of immortality, I guess. I mean, did you always know what the different time periods were going to be, or did you discard some and add others over as you were writing? Or
no, actually, I didn't. I didn't have any alternatives, really. It's funny to think that, since it's obviously so episodic. I knew it was going to be episodes. I knew that, and in fact, I kind of had the idea that there would be 12. They don't quite count out that way now, but I thought it would be an episodic, almost picaresque kind of novel, with a hero who goes through various adventures over time. And as I was working, I said, all right, I have 12 time periods. When are they going to be? And things would come up that I would consider. I knew it was going to be a Celtic world. Where does the Celtic world end up? It ends up in Christianity 500 years later. And if that's the case, then you go with St. Brendan across the ocean to North America. And once there, he's got a North American life to live with Native Americans. And then what? Well, then white people come. It kind of accumulated pretty naturally. Oh, and the other book that I was reading at the time was a book about the dead in the Civil War. It was written by the former president of Harvard, a woman. His name I can't remember also. And it was an amazing book about what people at the time thought about the people who had died and how they imagined them as dead people and what they thought of the other world, which they thought they believed, all of them believed people went to. And I read also a book about spiritualism and mediumship and all of that, which was very big at the time, partly as a result of all the people who had died during the Civil War. Now, the other thing is, I'm not sure when I came up with the idea that all of this would somehow be told through the medium of one human being who takes in the crow and nurses him back to health. I can't tell you how that arose either. So maybe I'm sort of a unconscious writer. I don't know.
Were you apprehensive at all about trying to write such an epic story from the point of view of a crow? Is that a challenge?
It was a challenge to make it convincing and rich, yes. I never thought that I would fail at it. For some reason, I don't think that when I write books. I think I'm going to be a huge success. Sometimes I am, and sometimes I'm not, in the view of other people. But I tend to have a kind of crazy confidence in the ideas that I get and that I can bring them off. So that wasn't so much the problem. I did come upon lots of you might call practical problems. How was he going to communicate with human beings? I didn't want him to just talk to humans as in a sort of talking animal fantasy. I wanted it to be more realistic in some way than that, even though it isn't really realistic. So I conceived the idea that in various times and places, various human beings would learn to talk to him in the way that he is described as learning to talk to Foxcap in the very beginning of the book. That is to say, the human speaks in human words and the crow speaks in crow words, and each of them learns the other's language. And I said, well, that'll do. And so I wanted to avoid the trap of the talking animal book, basically, where animals in the stories are basically human beings dressed up as animals, in effect. They have some animal problems to deal with specific to their type and their situation, but basically they're human beings. And I wanted them not to be that way, if I could avoid it.
Right, and all these human characters are all mystics of some sort or another, and they're kind of halfway between our world and the spirit world. So it kind of makes sense for them to be able to communicate in some sort of supernatural kind of way.
Yes, that's right, that they are all that way. I mean, I'm not sure that all human beings aren't that way, but these are the ones that I picked have a job to do. That is to say, in the world of the dead and the world of story. So, yes, and it would be unlikely, I suppose, that the crow would just happen to find himself with such people, but he does seek them out. In the section with the monk in it, it's he who seeks out the monks, not the other way around. And in the Native American sequence, too, he is the one who starts following around this tale teller who ends up telling or retelling in his own fashion Dar Oakley's life and story.
Yeah, and I feel like I learned a lot about crows from reading this book. And could you say, like, because obviously the crows talk to each other, so I mean, it's maybe, you know, it's fictionalized somewhat, but how accurate is the idea of crow interactions that you get from this book?
I have a feeling that crows don't talk to each other. That is to say, they don't have a language of words that represent things in the world. I don't think they do. I think they're very yakety and they talk a lot, but we don't hear, or I don't hear. I haven't been close enough to crows to actually listen to see if they are making noises, you know, that are different from their cawing, calling, and crying out and yelling, which is the language of crows that we can hear. I don't know if they have a way of communication that's like, you know, different from that.
parent birds, all parent birds, talk to their young in a kind of quieter way, I think. Or at least that's my assumption. But I don't think they talk in the way that human beings. I don't think anybody talks to others of their kind except human beings.
Right. I mean, but you talk about how, for example, if one crow is in danger, they'll send out some special cry, and all the crows in the area will.
That's absolutely so. Yes, all that, all the actual, besides the language stuff of talking to each other and like people, all of the crow behavior is. I've studied it, and it is fairly accurate, as accurate as I could make it. So. Yeah, that I worked hard on that, and I actually tried to get some interest from a couple of different experts in crow life, crows and ravens, and whose books I'd read, and I tried to get hold of them and say, "Would you like to read this crazy book I wrote about a talking crow?" And maybe I shouldn't be surprised they didn't answer. I don't know, but they didn't. So there may be errors in it as far as the latest crow studies go, but it has been shown. I don't know if you have been watching and reading about it, but they have proved amazing things about crow intelligence. Crows are, without a doubt, the smartest beings, animals, for their brain size, brain to body ratio of anybody else. Even the great apes, even parrots, who are famous for being smart.
Yeah,
Those are the smartest.
I just saw this headline recently where it was something like crows had to get a treat by pulling on a string to pull it out of the thing, and then like some of the crows would learn how to do it, and then they would explain to the other crows somehow how to do it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And the other thing they proved, which astonished them, is Indonesian crows, which are somehow especially smart, can do a two-step problem. That is to say, in order to get the string, you have to do another task in order to get the string. So you solve the problem first of getting the string, then you use the string to get the food. And they can figure that out, which is really kind of sensational. But they are enormously inventive in their own behaviors that nobody has taught them to do. There are crows in, I can't remember, this might be Japan, I'm not certain where this is, but they like to eat a certain kind of nut that has a hard shell. And what they have learned to do is these nut trees grow along a road or a street, and the nuts fall on the ground. The crow picks up a nut, takes it to the middle of the road, sets it down, and rushes back out of the way, and waits for a car to drive over the nut. And then he goes out and eats the meat. But this is risky, because he could get run over while he's sitting there eating it. What they have figured out is that if the light is red 100 yards down the road, crows can see four times farther and 3 times sharper than we can. They can see this red light down the road. So when the light turns red, they rush out, put the nut down, come back. Light turns green, car drives over the nut. They go out. Then they wait till the light turns red again, so they know it's safe to go out and eat the nut.
Wow. That's really impressive, yeah. So,
it is.
I mean, what would you say were some of the best resources that you found about crows?
Well, the one that I started with is Bernd Heinrich, who wrote the great book about crows and ravens. Hold on just one second. No, I put away all my crow books in the attic.
Oh, no.
But Bernd Heinrich is the great expert in crows and ravens, and his book was enormously popular because it was so personal. I mean, he's more of a raven guy than a crow guy, but I learned a lot about crows from his book. Another one was a guy named Marzluff, Marzluff, who was in Seattle. And he and another guy, whose name I can't remember, wrote a book called In the Company of Crows and Ravens. And he learned an enormous amount about crows and their ability to recognize human beings, for one thing. There are studies that he did that are quite remarkable. He put on a sort of scary mask and climbed up a tree while crows were raising young in a nest. And the crows were furious, of course, and drove him off. Finally, so that he would go back down to the street and take the mask off. And months later, he could go up in the tree with the same mask on, and they'd drive him off again. Or walk down the street, and they would mob him from the air. They'd recognize that face that he wore.
Wow. I wonder if you should have just sent these guys your book and just not told them about the reincarnation stuff. Just say, I've written a book about crows. Would you like to take a look at it? And...
I didn't. All I did was say, well, actually, yes, I admitted that it was a sort of a fantasy. So maybe I shouldn't have done that. But they may pick it up if its reputation grows sufficiently. They may want to pick it up. I have a feeling they would instinctively, stay away from it.
Mm.
I mean, I don't think rabbit experts ever picked up Watership Down. Though his animal descriptions of their lives and the way they interacted and so on were apparently highly researched also.
It was funny because yesterday my mom was asking me, she said she has a friend of a friend who's she's really, really into crows, and would she like this book? And I said, I think so, but it depends on how she feels about reading detailed descriptions of crows eating people's faces.
Yes, I remember when I first was talking about it to my former editor at HarperCollins about this idea. And she had loved my previous novel, Four Freedoms. Partly she particularly liked the way I wrote about sex in that one. And so I was telling her about this book. She's going to be about crows? I said, yeah, crows. I think that's really interesting. Crows? She said, crow sex? I said, yes. And she made this ew kind of face. And I knew then that probably I didn't have a sale there.
Well, actually, you ended up selling this book to Joe Monty, who's a friend of the show. You want to talk a little bit about, what was the process of getting it published?
Sure. I had changed agents before I started trying to sell this book. My agent now is Howard Morhaime. And Howard thought it was a great book and thought he would have little trouble selling it. But he had a huge trouble selling it. Many editors loved it. Some names you'd know, I'm sure, but they couldn't get publishers to buy it. Publishers were saying, wow, a book about a crow? I don't think so. And they just couldn't convince their publishers to buy it. He went through like 20 editors. Some of them just said no, but many of them said, yes, I'd love to, but I can't. And I guess Joe has sufficient clout within Simon & Schuster with his own imprint that he was able to do it. And even he said, I want to buy this very much. I'm going to try very hard. And even he took it. It took some talking, I guess, to sell it to the publishers. I think Joe's wonderful. I think he's great. I think his imprint is terrific. The books that he publishes are extremely attractive and interesting and unusual. And I mean, I guess he publishes some fairly standard science fiction and fantasy, but most of the titles I've noticed look really intriguing.
Yeah, just for listeners, it's called Saga. It's an imprint of Simon & Schuster. Saga,
yes, that's right. And it's within Simon & Schuster, which I think must be a great position to be in, actually, because, you're running your own shop and with very small number of people, like 2. And within that, you got the resources of Simon & Schuster all around you to take on all the rest of it, or much of the rest of it anyway. At least that's how I see it. I might be all wrong about that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that you had so much trouble selling the book because you said that you conceived it to be a more popular kind of book than some of your previous ones.
I wouldn't say that exactly. I guess so. Here's what I thought. The last 2 or 3 books that I've written, there's one about an aircraft plant in the Second World War called Four Freedoms. Before that, I wrote a book about Lord Byron and his lost novel, which is recovered by these 2 people in the 20th century. And before that, I wrote The Translator, which was set in the 1950s in a college in the Midwest. And none of these sold very well at all, but they were completely ignored by the people who loved my earlier fantasy work.
So it occurred to me that I would like to write a book that would win back that fantasy audience. Since I seem not to have been a huge success anyway in winning any other kind of audience. So I knew these people would if I would write a book that would touch them in some way or appeal to them, that I would probably get a readership for this book. And I did, and I am doing. So the plan is working so far.
I mean, could you say a little bit more about what sort of reaction you've been getting to the book from fantasy readers?
If nothing else, my Facebook page is filled up with people saying, I love this book, it's wonderful, and so on. So that's one thing. My Facebook is full. My Facebook friends are heavily tilted towards people who read fantasy and science fiction. The reviews have been really great too. Gary Wolfe, whose name you know, I'm sure, reviewed it for the Chicago Tribune very positively. And Liz Hand, who's another major person in fantasy and science fiction, wrote a LA Times review. It was like a review of my whole career that was pretty long, and I was very impressed with it. And Michael Dirda, who is a reviewer of all kinds of books for the Washington Post and has been since the Middle Ages, he also has a particular soft spot for fantasy and science fiction, and he reviewed it very positively too. So I think my bargain here is working out.
I guess I'll also just mention for listeners that John Joseph Adams, who's our producer, is well known.
Joseph Adams was another one who really, really wanted to write. In fact, he was very sorry that he couldn't get the book because he couldn't get his publishers to step up.
Yeah, so John has an imprint at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and so he read this in draft, and he told me it was one of the best books he's ever read. So
yes, he has been. I have heard him. He has said similar things to me. So he was the other one, but somehow he couldn't get Houghton Mifflin to step up. I don't know. You'd have to ask him the story.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, I'm in awe of this book. I mean, just as as someone who writes fiction myself, I'm just so impressed that it's just such a amazing accomplishment. Just how just good it is in so many ways.
Well, thank you.
And just like the research, as you were mentioning, I mean, just seems like it must have been intense. And I was wondering, could you talk about actually, this book incorporates a lot of different folklores and sort of pre-existing histories and stories and things, it seems. Could you talk a little bit about which things you were drawing on?
Well, for the Celtic world, where Dar Oakley begins his life, and that kind of Celtic folklore is fairly general. Of course, I have the great book of Celtic mythology, which I can. That one I thought I did have here right in front of me, but I don't. But there's two guys who write. Have written the most thorough book about Celtic mythology, and that's one I drew upon for my book. I don't.
Yeah, maybe I should have warned you ahead of time. I was going to ask you about all your research.
Yeah, here. I could have assembled all these. I'll send you a note, and you can attach it as a note. Yes, that was. But I researched Celtic mythology, and which I had read about a lot in the past for other projects that I never actually finished or really even began on. But I was interested in it very much.
Actually, let me just ask you on that subject. I noticed there was a line about the cauldron that can bring warriors back to life, which of course makes me think of Lloyd Alexander.
Well, it's a standard piece of Celtic mythology. Yes. No, I didn't make that up, and neither did he. It's a part of Celtic mythology that there was such a cauldron, and apparently they even knew where it was. It was in Britain, but if you went over to Britain, then nobody ever managed to find it. I don't think.
but it was supposed to be in Britain, and a lot of Celtic tales are told about it. So yeah, no, I didn't make that up.
How about
there was a lot of things that you might think that I had made up, but that I didn't.
Well, actually, I have a whole list here of things that I was kind of curious about. So there's the Happy Valley, the most precious thing, the Isles of the Blessed, the Paradise of the Birds, the Fortunate Isles, the Small Ugly People, and the Sky Gate.
Well, okay. Of that list, I think they're all came out of research. The only one the one that I gave a special name to, the most precious thing, that's just my name for that thing of immortality. I'm sure you caught when the most precious thing is talking to Dar Oakley in the other world, when Dar Oakley is trying to steal the most precious thing from Foxcap, who was supposed to be the one who got it. The most precious thing tells him the story of Gilgamesh going down into the river, into the sea, and finding the plant that gives immortality. The most precious thing, who is nothing now, he continually talked about as nothing, tells the story. So there's Gilgamesh. It's like I threw that in as one of the past adventures of this thing that can grant you immortal life. And when Dar Oakley hides the most precious thing in the root of a tree, and makes a dag with his beak on the tree so he'll remember which tree it is, and then goes away and gets Foxcap, and they go back together to find it. And every tree that they look at is the same tree, and every tree has a mark of it on its beak. That comes from an old Irish folktale about finding the leprechaun and forcing him to tell you where his gold is buried, and he says it's buried under this tree, and the kid wants to go home and get a big bucket so he can carry home all the gold, and then he wraps his scarf around the tree and goes home to get the bucket, and he comes back. Every tree in the forest has a red scarf tied around it.
I saw a Saturday morning cartoon with that premise, so that's where I'm familiar with it.
It's very old. Always works. One of those that always work. So that's the most precious thing, but the name itself was just something I made up myself for that use, but everybody knows what it is. What were the other ones?
The Happy Valley, the Isles of the Blessed.
Happy Valley is, again, that in of course, as Foxcap uses the term, is sarcastic. It's not happy. It's a land of death, and she has to make clear to Dar Oakley. When he says, well, people must enjoy coming here. You fighting all day, feasting all night, get killed, get up again. And she says, no, it's not. Don't say that. It's not happy. They don't want to come here. So even the ones who are great in the world don't want to come here. So the Happy Valley is kind of sarcasm, but that one I made up myself too.
Yeah.
As a term. The Isles of the Blessed is very common in Celtic mythology. The lands to the west in the Celtic world are very important, partly because some of them, at least up in the north, could be reached by competent sailors. Even back in the 5th and 4th and 3rd centuries, they were making it up to these outlying islands up there. And of course, the northern peoples were coming down too and seeing them. And they knew that there were others to the west. Somehow the west was a land of goodness in Celtic mythology. And it was always imagined that out there were these islands where anything could happen. And those are in the stories of Brendan, who supposedly sailed, or the story is that he sailed across the Atlantic and came to these islands in the west. Nobody is sure that he ever actually did. Nobody is even sure that any such voyage was attempted. It might be purely legendary. And what is certain is that there was a St. Brendan, but the story of St. Brendan's travels is hundreds of years later than his own life. So it's a compilation of fabulous tales. And the longer, of course, as with all saint stories, the farther away you get from it, the more amazing the story gets, which is what I tried to do in the book. I don't know if you noticed, but when it's recounted, Brendan's journey is recounted. It seems the things they come upon the first time around when Dar Oakley takes the journey are sort of realistic places. I mean, they come upon a sort of volcanic mountain and they come upon various different lands. But when the story is finally told, all of those places have become magical and amazing and unreal.
Yeah. So that's like it. So in the book, there's the characters Foxcap and Brother, and they kind of, if I have this right, they kind of become saints, right? And so the stories of the
right. Foxcap becomes a saint, and so does the singer, though you don't hear less about him. Yeah. Yes, Foxcap. Well, that happened a lot. I mean, the stories about Celtic heroes who mostly didn't exist. I mean, they were folktale characters themselves. Some of them were real enough, but over time, when the Christian world was built by these wandering monks to start with, and then attached to Rome and so on, a lot of these old Celtic heroes and figures turned into Christian saints. It's a marvelous kind of thing that happens. One of the most amazing one is a French story about Saint Guinefort. I don't know if you ever heard of Saint Guinefort, but Saint Guinefort was a dog. There was an old Roman story of this couple who left home on a journey and left their dog in charge of their baby, who was in a crib. And while they were gone, this huge snake came in and threatened the baby. And the dog chased the snake out and chased it into the forest, had a mighty struggle with the snake, and killed the snake, and then came back and sat down beside the baby to guard it. Okay? And the parents can come home. And they see the baby in his crib asleep, and the dog sitting next to it with blood all over his mouth. And so the wife screams, and they say the dog has attacked the baby. The husband pulls his sword without even checking to see if the baby is alive, and kills the dog. And only then do they go out and they realize there's the dead snake and the baby's still alive, and they made a terrible mistake. So they bury the dog and put up a monument to him, talking about what a wonderful dog he'd been, and so on and so on. Something like 500 years more later, this dog has become a saint, a protectress or protector of babies. And there's a shrine and a special tree. Maybe there's supposed to be the tree where they buried the dog. I don't know. But there's a tree where women used to take their babies to see if they couldn't, especially if they were sickly. And a spring, an ice-cold spring that rose near where this tree was. And the women would take their sickly babies and dunk them in this cold spring, and hold them down in the water. And if they could, if Saint Guinefort was kind, they'd flourish. They'd come out and they'd be okay, they'd flourish. But if they weren't, they'd die. And they could be buried there, and everybody would be sort of satisfied with that. It was almost sort of like, a way of taking care of babies that weren't going to thrive, that were going to die, without really feeling like you killed them. You'd somehow given them over to Saint Guinefort to take care of.
Wow.
Is that amazing?
Yeah. How about the Anna Kuhn character? Is that a historical person?
No. None of them are historical persons. They don't know. There's nobody in the story who is not made up. Could
you talk about how you developed the Anna Kuhn character? She's sort of a medium around the time of the Civil War.
Yes, she is. Well, I told you, I read this book. Again, I can't remember the guy's name. I'm very old, One of the things you can't remember his name. Even ones you know well, you can't remember. But I read it. It was a really fine book about spiritualism in just preceding and then following the Civil War. And this thing that went on in the 1840s and so on, where there was a lot of women who were walking in their sleep or lying awake all night and talking and kind of preaching in kind of religious language, and then sort of falling asleep at dawn, and when they woke up couldn't remember any of it.
and they were famous, and they were written about, and they were all kind of they were generally regarded as somehow blessed or in touch with God in some way. And so I said, that's a great idea. And because in the various realms of the dead that I talk about, the one that Nana Kuhn is in touch with is different from any of the others. It's not one where you can visit. It's the other side. You have to die to go there. So those women who were these sort of sleep talkers and sleepwalkers in the 1840s and 1850s are one part of a trend that worked its way through the Civil War and beyond up until, it started to fade away in the 20th century, that are actually part of the major origins of spiritualism. That is to say, that kind of belief that the dead are in a place that we can't reach alive, but from whom we can get messages and speak and understand and hear their voices, especially hear their voices. A lot of it was about hearing what they said. And then since Anna Kuhn is blind, that's how she does it. She hears voices. And she knows she's hearing the voices of people who are dead. And it was much influenced by the religious writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, who's now kind of forgotten a lot, but he was enormously influential in the early 19th century. This Swedish guy who had all these elaborate visions of what it's like to be dead and what it's going to be like for us when we go to heaven, and that really the real world is heaven, not earth. Earth is kind of an illusion in a way. It's not really real. We're going to die, and we're going to come. If we have lived good lives, we'll come into a world that is almost exactly the same as this world we're in, but much better, much more wonderful, much more gratifying, where we can live, and we can then in that realm we can go on to higher and higher realms of possibility, getting closer and closer to God and the angels. We will be angels. Angels are dead people in Swedenborg's imagination. They're not in standard Christian theology, of course. They're, angels are created by God from before there were people. But to Swedenborg, the angels are dead people. They're spirits of dead people that have grown more and more powerful and beautiful and wonderful.
I mean, it seems like that's not your conception of the afterlife, though. At least as I read it in this book, it seems a lot spookier and like a place where the rug is always being pulled out from under you.
Yes, right. Yes, that's right. No, I didn't. I wanted the other world to be as ambiguous as I could make it. I mean, it has to be. I think in order to be convincing, it can't just be a parallel world that's like nothing but its own rules. It's got to have a kind of quality of non-existence at the same time as you're positing that the characters go there and meet people and so on. It has to have an ambiguity. It has to have a way of vanishing on you, either for good or bad. So yeah, no. I'm not a Swedenborgian, and neither is Anna. Though she does picture the other world to which her husband and her husband's brother have died and gone to, or are on their way to, as a good world, as a better world, a better place, as they always said in the 19th century. He's in a better place.
I mean, would you say that your conception of the afterlife, are you drawing that from any particular religious tradition or literary?
No, I'm drawing it. I'm trying to draw it from all of them. I mean, the hell or purgatory that the brother goes to is, that is talked about a lot. There's several accounts of saints who went down into these other worlds sometimes via a dream, but sometimes via these holes in the ground that they go down into, and that leads you down into this realm in which you're supposed to, make it to the other realm and then see if you can safely make it out again. This was really a Celtic Christian practice, believe it or not. In fact, it was a Greek one too. The Greeks had some certain places
where you spent time down in a sort of cave or hole in the ground and tried to stay there for a night or longer. And then when you got out, you would report on all that you saw, which, of course, if you're shut up in a dark hole in the ground, you probably have some stuff to talk about when you get back out. But the purgatories or other worlds that the Celtic saints were in were exactly like the one I described. Had all these demons that would torment you and judgments that went on and so on. So I didn't make up any of that part, except that mine is my own. And it's the same with the spiritualist realm of the dead that Anna Kuhn talks about. That was the way they thought about it. In fact, I think that in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, hell kind of disappeared somehow. That people died, especially maybe horribly bad people had some sort of punishment in the afterlife. But I don't think they talked nearly so much about hell in the 1840s, 50s, 60s as they did later on. Maybe because so many people had died in the war that they just couldn't conceive of them filling up hell. That just was too horrible to think of.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned to you that I also read Totalitopia, and there's this story, This Is Our Town, about a character growing up in sort of a Catholic childhood.
Yes, right.
And I was wondering how autobiographical that was. The thing that really struck me is the priest or somebody says about going out on Halloween that the kids have to watch out because there are real demons out on Halloween who might steal your soul if you're not careful.
Well, I grew up Catholic in about that same period, but that's not autobiographical in any real sense. It actually is, however, based on a children's book, a school book, Catholic school book called This Is Our Town. I have it in my hand right now. And it's, standard. I don't know if you're probably too young to have had these kind of readers when you were a kid that had these stories about little kids and big type and easy to read and stuff like that. The Catholic school readers, of which this is one, always also had stories of saints and, stories about Catholic practice and so on. But a lot of it is just stories about these kids in this little town. The whole story of, I think that it was written about, even though it was written by a nun, according to the book, I think the story is based on somewhere actual, because there's that whole elaborate story of the flood. It's much longer in the book than it is in my version. Now, I changed a lot of details. There's no guardian angels in the book. Not that anybody talks to. I mean, there are, guardian angels were a standard feature of Catholic belief when I was a kid.
I mean, were you afraid of demons? Like, did you have that sort of?
No, I just thought that was a wonderful thing to be able to do. And I wanted it. The great thing about Halloween, which everybody loves Halloween, but in Christian practice, it is the case that is All Hallows Eve. That is the day before All Saints Day. And on All Saints Day, it is, in Catholic practice, you can go to church and say a set of specific prayers and release people from purgatory, same purgatory that the brother was in. And they get to go to heaven. Their punishment's over and they get to go to heaven. And so that's what the little girl does. And she hopes that her Uncle Winnie somehow made it to heaven, and she hopes that the little boy that she saw as a ghost, because the ghosts can't come from heaven, and they can't get out of hell. So they must be these spirits that are half in and half out, that somehow they're not decided on yet.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned this idea of releasing people from purgatory into heaven in context of one of the other pieces in this book, which was about Russian cosmism, because it's sort of a sort of technological version of that same idea almost.
Right, it is. You're right. Yes, those guys were amazing, really amazing. I felt like I had made them up. But I hadn't. It was quite factual, and I didn't even get to some of the craziest stuff. So,
yeah, yeah, but so one of these guys, he had this idea, and you went to a conference about this, you say, but basically he had this idea that if we conceive of time, space as one unified thing, that maybe it's theoretically possible to retrieve all the information from the past, in which case, and this is a lot of ifs here, but in which case maybe it's possible to reconstruct the consciousness of anyone who's ever lived. And that should be really the project of humanity, should be to try to achieve immortality and then rescue everyone who ever lived, rescue their mind information.
Right. That philosopher said, our ancestors brought us to life, gave us life. We have to give life back to them, which means all the people that are buried on Earth, but also the ones who have somehow been blown away into the dust of their bodies or whatever has been over thousands of years been blown away into outer space. We have to go out and rescue all those and identify each one and put them all back together again. This guy has still an enormous reputation in Russia as a seer, as a saint, as a mystic, not as somebody whose plans you would actually follow, but he is highly respected still. It's very weird.
Yeah, and I like it because he's not thinking small there. No. I like the
no, he's not. And I think that one of the reasons that kind of cosmism is appealing to a certain class of people who are thinking now about AI and quantum stuff, because it does seem to resemble it. I mean, the idea that you can reassemble a consciousness in some way. I mean, a lot of people are thinking about consciousness in that way, thinking that you're going to get it into some sort of digital form, or so that it can be reproduced endlessly and doesn't ever have to die, and it can go out into outer space for billions of miles because it's just data. You can see why the two things would attract one another. They do, apparently.
Yeah, and the guy's name, I have it here, is Nikolai Fedorovich Fedorov.
Fedorov, yes, right. Nikolai Fedorov, right. Yep, that's him. And an amazing person. He was a saintly guy, apparently. He worked all his life in this one little library and never took a salary if he didn't have to, or when he did take a little salary, he'd give it away to poor people. He wore the same clothes for years and years and years. And the story is, didn't have a bed. He slept on a humpbacked trunk. Now, how you can sleep on a humpbacked trunk, I have no idea. Once you roll off, it was so mysterious to me. But I read it in more than one source. He slept on a humpbacked trunk.
Maybe okay. you just get used to it after a while.
I guess so. I don't know. But he was so highly, and he never published anything. It was only at the end of his life that some of his followers, who thought he was this sort of saintly, amazing, mystic figure with these huge ideas, assembled a bunch of his writings and published them. And he was very angry with them for having published them. I don't know why he thought. I mean, maybe he thought that the humans he taught would carry his ideas forth all by themselves. But I don't know.
But I mean, just this whole project of making everyone who's ever existed immortal kind of raises the issue that, and this comes up in Ka too, is there such a thing as too much life? Yes,
right, yeah, right. Yes, well, that's one of the reasons why these afterlives are so ambiguous too. That book about called The Dominion of the Dead is very clear that one of the reasons we do what we do with dead people. We mourn them, we carry on, we cry, we weep, and then we carry them to these graves and put them in the graves and cover them up and put stones over them. We have to get rid of them. They can't share anymore in our life. We have to put them where they no longer can have a part, or we'll never get our own lives built. He says we bury them in order to put them away from us, and we mourn them in order to bury them in ourselves, where they can rest. We put them at rest in ourselves by our mourning for them. The dead just have to be, in some way, both excluded and remain with us at the same time, which is a really kind of an idea of a sort that interests me a lot to think about how that would work.
I mean,
the Native American story when the man whose brother was killed on the trail by the people who captured them, that's what he's doing. He says he has become one of the people who captured him through this strange Native American process, which is also exactly true and does happen. I didn't make it up. But he has to bury his brother and cover him up and say, okay, now you rest. You can't be with me anymore. He's not even talking the brother's language anymore because he has adopted these other people's language and ways.
I mean, see, I feel like I would be okay with immortality. I mean, and I feel like that people will say, I feel like because it's so, hypothetical, that people will try to come up with reasons why death is good. They'll say, oh, well, the transitory nature of life is what makes life meaningful and so on. But I feel like if everyone were immortal, nobody would be saying, there would be a small minority who would be expressing that opinion,
Well, I don't know. I can see your point. I have always thought that I wouldn't necessarily want to go on living more life if I could just stay in possession with this life that I've got and not have to give it up and die.
No, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I'm talking about temporal immortality. And people will say, I mean, wouldn't you just get bored after a while? But that just seems like maybe, I mean, if we're talking about quantum resurrection of the dead and all this kind of stuff, I mean, that might just be another engineering problem to be solved. I mean, you can probably take a drug that would make you more interested in being alive or something,
Yeah, right. Well, you could also probably take a drug that would cause you to feel like you had lived forever. It could slow down your time far enough, so that 1 second appeared to you as like, a million years or whatever.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea.
Become immortal within your own lifespan. You've lived forever.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so you should be a science fiction writer. The ideas like that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about science fiction is that the ideas are, come to everybody. All kinds of great ideas come to everybody. But then you have to actually, make up people and language and dialogue and scenes. And
yeah, that's the trick right there.
That's the tricky part. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it has to be 100 pages long, or something. You can't stop. This has been a problem.
Well, and there's this other article in Totalitopia where you talk about one of the really tricky parts about trying to write science fiction is how nobody seems to be able to predict the future with any degree of accuracy at all.
Right. Yes. Right. Right. Yes. That was. I mean, that's deliberately paradoxical, of course. I don't know. Maybe some people have been more successful than others about predicting the future. But there is a sort of permanent wall or unbreachable wall between us and what is to come. You can make all kinds of guesses about it. And, of course, you can make some successful guesses about it. But you can't actually predict a future world. There's just too many random variables that are going to happen between now and then. And things that you look at and you say, it is certain that this is going to continue. How could this possibly stop? But, of course, it does and has done in the past more than once. I remember, speaking of Catholics and Catholic churches, have you read The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse?
I have not, no.
Hermann Hesse was a German writer in the 1930s, 20s and 30s. He wrote several books about oddly unreal topics. He wrote a life of Siddhartha, which is about the Buddha growing up. And his book, The Glass Bead Game, is set like 500 years in the future, after many, many troubles have occurred, and wars and so on, and bad societies coming and going, and finally gets reestablished. And what has persisted through all of it is the Catholic Church, exactly as it is now, exactly as it was in the 1930s, not as it is now. It's completely different now than it was in the 1930s. So that even an an institution like the Catholic Church, which seems on the face of it to be unchangeable, and which continually claims to be unchangeable and always has. If you sat down in 1950 and said the church will be the same, all the things are going to change, but the church will be the same, and it was the thing that changed. Other things stayed the same, but the church changed. So it's a paradoxical relation to time to try to imagine the future, which I enjoyed.
Well, I mean, you suggest in this essay, I'm not sure how facetious you're being, but that the best way to predict the future would just be to take what science fiction writers are predicting and assume the exact opposite will happen.
Right. That's right. Well, one of the things that you can predict the opposite of is that in 1950 science fiction, they were always predicting, we'd be, colonizing Mars. We'd be getting out to farther planets around distant suns, and we have no closer to that than we were in 1950. So you can say, nope, not going to happen, and eventually it's going to be forgotten about as an enterprise. It's just too hard. A lot of people that I read now are saying it is going to be given up as an enterprise. The idea, not necessarily going to Mars, because that's kind of close enough and it's sort of interesting, but colonizing Mars, somehow I doubt it. And getting to planets around other suns, light years away, and colonizing them. I suppose you could project it into the million-year frame, and who knows? That doesn't even, anybody can think about that one. Pretend anything you want about that one. But if you're trying to predict the next, say, 100 years, I doubt it very much.
I mean, in an episode a year or two ago, I interviewed a guy he wrote a biography of Frederick Pohl, and he was talking about how Asimov and Pohl wrote a book, I think it was called Our Angry Earth, something like that, about how global warming was going to be a huge issue, and this was even before Rachel Carson, and that does seem to be one that really, was a pretty accurate prediction.
Okay, that's one. But in a way, the big scare of my young years in the 50s and 60s was overpopulation, which that was, there's lots and lots of stories, science fiction stories about overpopulation ruining the world. Stand on Zanzibar is one of them. And it didn't happen between then and now. In fact, the population of the United States is almost stable. We're almost not reaching population replacement numbers. Now, the overall population, India and China and so on, are still, filling up and producing more and more and more. But they are also trying very hard to stop it. And 50 years after the population bomb came out, which was in the 1960s, the book that predicted we were all going to be overwhelmed by too many people in 50 years. And we're not overwhelmed by too many people. In fact, like I say, in certain highly technological and advanced societies, Europe and the United States, population is going down, not up, which is, not too surprising, really, when you think about it.
Yeah. Actually, we did an episode on overpopulation in science fiction just a couple episodes ago. So if anyone missed that and you want to hear, I have a lot more to say about this, but you can, I don't want to repeat what I said there. But I did want to ask you sort of on that topic, I guess. One of the things you say in that essay is that you say that in the future that there will be basically the same amount of pain and insufficiency as any human world at any time.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you know this. There's a book by Steven Pinker that came out within the past few years where he basically is called The Better Angels of Our Nature.
Oh, yeah, I read about it. I read reviews of it. I haven't read the book.
But the thesis of it basically is that your chance of dying violently from 100,000 years ago or something to now has basically been a steady downward trend.
Yes. But you know what? If you say, all right, my chances of dying violently have gone down, but what about my chances of living 20 years with dementia? That's gone way, way up. So you have to balance the two of them. you have a 50% chance, I was just reading, or almost a 50% chance, if you get to 85, of getting Alzheimer's. Do you know how many people got Alzheimer's in the old days?
Well, because they didn't live. Well, they didn't live long enough.
Nobody got to 85. They didn't live that long. So every age, I think, has pains that no other age has got, and if you live long enough, you see the world of your. This never happened before. The world can be different to you, and you can seem a stranger in it, just by growing from 15 to 75, and the loss you feel about that, and the confusion and bafflement you sometimes feel, can be really terrible. And people didn't feel that way. Of course, the world could change in a minute. The Vikings could, overwhelm your island and kill everybody, or the Christians could come in and make everybody a Christian and, tear down all the statues of your old gods. I don't mean that it never happened, but it seems to be in a particular kind of way now that is new and replaces some of the old pains and old griefs with new ones. I mean, who could have thought? I mean, he could say that the amount of people dying of violence is lesser, person by person. But do you add in the 6 million people who died in the Holocaust? The 50 million people who died in the Soviet Union because of how the Soviet project was pursued? Got to add them in too,
Well, I mean, what do you think then about just the idea of progress? Is that just an illusion, or I mean, I know you teach a class on utopias at Yale. Do you have?
Yeah, I do.
Like, what do you think about the idea of a better future?
Well, I think there was when I read that, I wrote that article. It was written for a Lapham's Quarterly, and Louis Lapham's a very smart guy, and he read that essay that you read, and in there's this little tiny utopian projection. How it's all going to be one world in the future, and there's going to be a command economy that satisfies everybody because it'll all be, digitized, and everybody will get about what they want. There might not be a big surplus, but everybody will be satisfied, and there will be no wars, and so on and so on. And Louis Lapham, his editor, his assistant editor, told me that Louis read this little essay and then asked the guy, says, does he really believe this? And I mean, I don't know if I do or not. I mean, I think that the point of that essay was the projection of these imagined futures is a human constant and has become much more of a human constant in the last 100 years or so, 150, 200 years. And they are works of the human imagination. Is what they are. And the ones that fail are the ones that insist that this is either what is going to happen or what must happen. Those are the ones that end up on the trash heap of history. It's the ones that are pure expressions of human possibility, or what we would like to be human possibilities. Those are the ones that survive, and they can't be enacted. They just are beautiful dreams.
I mean, could you say
they're encouraging, but because we like to dream. I
mean, could you say a little bit more about? You described this proposal in this essay as a quote socialist utopia with a world government, a distribution system like Amazon's, but owned by the world. Could you say just expand on that?
No, I don't know how it's going to work. I mean, I did not set out. I mean, here's the thing: I wrote the essay in order to say that utopia is kind of a dream. Projecting the future is kind of an illusion, and utopia along with it is sort of. And so is dystopia, for that matter. They're both illusions because we can't know the future. So when I propose my own, that's what it's called, Totalitopia. It's a totalitarian utopia. That's why it's called that.
I imagine that people will just finally come to their senses and all agree to stop all this fighting and fighting over both resources and ideologies, and we will all understand that we are all men are brothers. That is to say, all siblings are persons, and we will understand that if we just act reasonably and rationally, we can actually satisfy. The technology exists to make a good life, or provide the means for a good life for everybody on the planet.
Right.
And do I believe that? I don't know.
Well, I thought it was a really interesting idea because, I mean, if you compare three different possibilities, right? A command economy with bad people in charge, a market economy, or a command economy with good people in charge. Obviously the command economy with bad people in charge is bad. We can dismiss that one. But so then you're comparing the command economy with good people in charge versus the market economy. And the problem that the command economy has is that the people in charge don't have enough information to make good decisions compared to a market, because the market is providing so much more information all the time to everyone about who needs what where. But you say, if we had good enough information processing, you can imagine something like Ian M. Banks's Culture series. You could maybe have a command economy, a high-tech command economy that actually outperformed a market economy.
Absolutely. I mean, what else? What else are we trending toward with all this knowledge that's collected in Facebook and in Amazon and Google and all that kind of stuff? It's all there, ready to go. All we have to do is agree to organize it in such a way that it is owned by everybody and not by Jeff Bezos and those guys, and turned into. I mean, it would be like what was desired about industrial economies at the end of the 19th century or in the early 20th century. They wanted them taken over in the same way, and instead of being ways to make profits for a small number of people, you would devote the fantastic resources of industrial capitalism. You would instead devote it to making a good life for everybody, and everybody would join in on it, and everybody had to have a say in it. That wasn't a crazy dream. The idea of anarcho-syndicalism, the idea that somehow that the industrial society would be sort of organized around these workplaces, and there would be groups and conferences of people that would join with other conferences, and there'd be no more nation states. There would just be this joining together of disparate loci, I guess you'd call it, of these huge industrial enterprises that are run by the workers themselves, not as a state giving orders or making laws, but just as a sensible organization of thinking people, like unions, And we didn't do that, and we're not going to do Totalitopia either. But to say that it's just silly to think that way, it's a little bit like, really, what you were asking me about the other world, the worlds of the dead that I thought of. They're ambiguous. They tend to vanish if you look too closely at them. They tend to not quite provide what they seem like they're going to provide. They provide something like it, but not really. That's the way I see utopia, too, in the same way. You present a vision, and people can say, oh, yeah, really? That's really, I can imagine that being actually the case. And then you think about it for a while, and gradually it kind of catters like a dream. And, you say, well, maybe not. Maybe human beings are just, basically evil. And then the problem is that he's got the wrong idea of human nature. My kind of utopia and a lot of other utopias depend on people having a certain kind of human nature that they probably don't have. That is to say, people don't want power. They just want goodness. People don't want more than they can ever use in their lifetime. All they really want is a sufficiency. Well, maybe not. Maybe we really are evil. Who knows? So.
Yeah, well, that's cheerful. Actually, before we run out of time.
By the way, there's a wonderful book you might want to look for if you can find it. It's called Red Plenty, and it's by Francis Spufford, Spufford, and it's a novel in a way, but it's almost all about real people in the Soviet Union in the 70s, and it was about the moment in which, if the Soviet command structure had allowed it, the Soviet technology guys, people who were working in data management and digital stuff and computers in the 70s, were on the point of figuring out how to run a command economy with data information. And the plans were getting clearer and clearer, but the society, of course, was in desperate trouble in the 70s. And eventually, the leadership suppressed it. Said, no, we're not going to go that way. We're going to go the old way with all the big, paper-bound books full of handwritten notes about how much bread and how much steel and how much, pork fat and all that kind of. And it was like, that was the end. Actually, that decision meant it was all over for the Soviet Union because the command economy was not working then, and it was not going to work. It was going to work less and less well until it was bankrupt.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll check that out. There's a line in Ka that recurs a couple times. Where there is plenty, there is peace. I was wondering if that sort of
right. Yeah, right. Certainly applies to crows. I mean, you don't have to fight over that last little scrap of dead squirrel. Everybody's happier.
Yeah. Okay, so before we run out of time, I also kind of want to ask you about. You have this essay in here about Paul Park's writing. Yeah, and there's this line about you're talking about Philip Pullman, and you say his narrative is as unsurprising and off the shelf as his world is imaginative and new. It progresses, as does Tolkien's, by a steady alternation of scenes of threat, danger, discomfort, and ignorance, and scenes of warmth, relief, and intimations of resolution. Each scene is like a brick put in place in a growing edifice whose shape and reason come clearer and clearer to us. And that kind of seems like a good story to me. But you sort of compare it unfavorably with Paul Park's writing.
Well, it's not bad. It's not a bad way to tell a story. It's just, I can remember noticing this in Tolkien when I read it for the first time, and the Tolkien books were just, they're kind of entrancing in a way. And even though I kept resisting it because it had this really simplistic style of organization. There's no doubt that they're absorbing and wonderful, but they kind of primitive that way as fiction, and probably what doesn't matter in a way, because that is so gratifying. It is gratifying to read that story where people are in trouble and it's cold and dark and there's threatening stuff around and you're in danger and sleeping out in the dark and so on. And then suddenly nice people come and rescue you, and it's warm and cozy, and there's a fire, and ale is drunk, and so on. Tom Bombadil shows up.
Okay, well, I'm not down with Tom Bombadil, but I take your point.
Well, nobody is, but I think it's okay. That is something that the reader can participate in viscerally throughout. If you're taken by the story. But it's also very simple. It's just like living as a baby, Sometimes you're cold and hungry and pissed off and yell a lot. And sometimes you're warm and happy and mommy is smiling and you're smiling back. But, there are more complex ways of constructing fictional universes. That's all.
Well, but I
am drawn, like Paul Park is, to that kind of complexity of possibility and also ambiguity. Is this a good scene? Is it? Instead of alternating good and bad, you just keep on producing things that are both good and bad, or bad with maybe good in them, or good that is maybe turning bad.
Well, like you talk in Paul Park's series, you mentioned that you say that there's this long episode that you say, quote, effectually comes to nothing, and is that I don't know? Does sophisticated fiction need sections where the reader wonders, like, well, what was the point of that, or like?
Well, I don't know. I think that I'm not sure. When I read the book, I didn't think what was the point of that. When I read that boxing scene, I was just so surprised by it and swept up in it. It wouldn't have occurred to me. I just went on to the next thing. I didn't say that. What was the point of that? Like, looking back, I can say that's an odd thing for a fiction of this kind to do. But it's not an odd kind of thing for
a realistic long novel by Saul Bellow or somebody to do. There's all kinds of things that come to nothing in realistic novels, especially deep thing, long kinds of realistic modern novels. It's only in certain, I mean, in the kinds of stories denominated romance in the largest sense, ought to have a more easily graspable structure and not wander off from it. But my books do, and so do Paul Park's. And they tend by that to join up romance in all of its glory and all of its shortcomings to the kinds of realistic fictions that have been being made since the middle of the 19th century. And they seem to have been parted entirely. But I think that in books like mine, what I kind of hope for in books like mine, books like Little Big and in Engine Summer and the Egypt novels, is to somehow not lose that connection that was, or to return to the place where those two kinds of fictions departed from each other sort of forever. And when I look at my reviews in Amazon, my Amazon reviews, sometimes I look through those and see how they're doing. And a lot of the reviews of Little Big say there's no story. I can't get into this book. There's no story in it. It's not. Nothing happens. It's just all these pages and pages and pages of description. And when I see reviews like that, I know the kind of books that reviewer likes, and I know pretty clearly the extent to which my book does not match that. And I mean, I don't mean to deprive anybody of the pleasure of reading books where lots of things happen continuously, and some are good and some are bad. I don't at all mean that. But I do, to me, the attraction of trying to make something very large and complex rather than having that kind of simple structure. The simple structures can produce wonderful things.
I mean that
the other kinds of structures do too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, but it does seem like it puts a ceiling on your popularity. I mean, do you think that's just an inherent reality given the way that people's brains process information and the distribution of personality traits and so on? Or do you see, like, could there be a alternate world where Little Big was like a Harry Potter or something?
I don't know. I don't think so. It has taken me a very, very long time to understand that it's probably not. And I mean, I'm a little bit better off than Paul Park, whose books sort of almost get people angry because they're not shaped like ordinary books. But no, I don't think that. It took me a long time to realize that even though the books that I was writing were intended to reach people at that kind of level, the kind of way that the Tolkiens and the Pullmans and the Harry Potters are trying to aim at people, it just wasn't going to happen. And it wasn't a choice of mine to really not do that and do something different instead, just for the hell of it. That's the way I think, and that's the way my fiction arises. It can't arise any differently than that. I'm stuck with what I am and the way I can conceive things. I mean, in a way, you can say that Cause is a much simpler book in some ways than Little Big, or than certainly than the Egypt books, which are another kind of big, scale fantasy work of its own kind. Cause much simpler and much more straightforward and episodic and so on. So maybe in my old age, I am kind of drifting back toward simpler kind of storytelling. But the funny thing is that I don't think writers can choose these things. I really don't. I think that your nature as a writer is more fixed than you can actually change it.
It's not that easy to suddenly turn yourself. I mean, everybody, you think to yourself when you're a young writer, well, I can write. I know how to construct paragraphs. I know how to make good sentences. I know how to tell stories. I ought to write, something like Dan Brown or something like, whatever, make lots of money. In fact, you can't. You can try, but your nature is going to prevent you from actually doing that. You have to be Dan Brown in order to write that way, or you have to be somebody like Dan Brown anyway. And I remember when I was first being a writer, thinking, well, all right, I published a book, my first science fiction novel, and they bought another book. That's now I'm a writer. So now what am I going to do? What should I do? How can I make a living doing this? And one of the things I conceived of doing was to write a roman à clef, one of those things where it's a disguised story about famous people, but they're all, have different names and stuff, but you've stolen all their adventures from the real world. And I was going to write a roman à clef about Leonard Bernstein, the conductor. I thought, this is great. This is perfect. Because, it's music, it's got Broadway in it, it's got famous people in it, it's got opera, it's got Maria Callas, it's got, Israel, there's a certain pull about Jewish big books about famous Jewish people that was at the time anyway a big deal. I said, I've got it. This is great. And I started thinking about how I could write this. I didn't know anything about music. That was going to have to hold me up, but I can do research. I can figure this out. And so I actually wrote a few pages of it. And the trouble was, as I look at it now, that the pages that I started with, it began with a dream sequence. And I said, okay, well, you see, I don't think you're going to be able to do this. You're just going to get tied up in your own fictional possibilities, and it's harder than you think to get out of them. All I could probably do is parody. I couldn't actually. You have to have the sincerity to write those things with, and if you don't have the sincerity, it's gonna come out. Nobody will like it, no matter how hard you try. You'll tell. They can tell.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, there's this quote on the back of the book, on the back of Totalitopia, that sort of struck me, where it says, Crowley has made his way out of the genre zoo, and all attempts to return him have so far proven unsuccessful.
Well, I don't know. Who said that?
It's on the back of the book. I don't know if Terry Bisson wrote it or what.
Well, I don't know. I guess that's true. I mean, the first three novels I wrote were certainly, conceived and written and sold as standard science fiction novels. But after that, I never really wrote another one. I mean, so I guess you could say I escaped at that point. But it doesn't seem like that to me. I mean, it seemed to me that I may have gotten away from science fiction, but I didn't get away from what John Clute calls fantastica at all, ever, not down to the present. All of my books have some element of the magical and the impossible in it. And some of them are dominated by it, and some of them are just carry hints of it.
What do you think about that genre zoo thing? Is that, having been, I guess, in both worlds, is the fantasy and science fiction world notably more zoo-like than the literary world, or?
Well, I think it's not a zoo is wrong. Zoo. I mean, when you say this is a zoo, you usually mean something that's not anything like a zoo, which is a very orderly and peaceful place. But when people say this is a zoo, they mean it's crazy chaos, and I don't think that's true of it at all. But certainly the numbers of different kinds of impulses at work in the science fiction and fantasy world make it kind of a little bit chaotic. I've often thought that I mean, people used to come up to me at like science fiction and fantasy conventions, which I went to along with everybody else to make my name known and so on. And to meet
writers whose work I really admired. And every once in a while, people would come up to me and say, "Oh, I'm so glad to meet you. You're one of my 2 favorite writers." And I learned over time not to ask who the other one was. But it taught me something about what the real deep fans of fantasy and science fiction are looking for in books and stories is something that doesn't need to be particularly well written or written with a kind of imaginative use of rhetoric and language. It just has to contain these elements that they're looking for. It's like, to be mean about it, this is kind of unkind. It's like, an alcoholic who is going to get the same kind of kick out of, a cheap bottle of vodka as a Chateau Lafite 49, and that's what he's getting. And the other qualities of it are nice, but not necessary. What's really necessary is that thrill that they get from, this is my kind of book. This is my kind of thing. This is a realm I can lose myself in. And so if that's the genre zoo, if that's what the quote refers to, then I guess I did get out of it. But in a certain sense, I lost a certain population in doing that, which is I felt bad about. This book, Ka, is in a certain way as close as I can come to recapturing that population.
So to giving them their next fix?
What? To
giving them their next fix?
Oh, their next fix. Oh, their next fix. I thought you said their next sticks. I couldn't figure out what you meant. No, I do not need to provide anybody with anything. This was a book I wanted to write anyway, but I also saw that in choosing, I have a couple of different ideas I could choose, and in choosing this one, I knew that I was trying to win back a readership that I seemed to have kind of lost. But at the same time, I wrote it exactly as I chose. I did not think while writing it, it would be better to write it this way in order to make it a fantasy novel than this way, which would make it some kind of modernist whatever. I did not think that ever. I just wrote it exactly the way I wanted it. So that's part of the reason it was so much fun to write. Because I knew that I was writing a fantasy novel and I could write anything and I was unconstrained by anything except my own imagination. But at the same time, I could write it exactly in the way that I wanted because I can't write it any other way.
Yeah, no, that all sounds great. I think it's great to be able to, write the books that you want and find the readers who are looking for those sorts of books.
Yeah.
And we're pretty much out of time here. So do you just have anything else you want to mention? I saw that it mentions in here that maybe there's a little big TV show in the works. Is there anything you can say about upcoming projects or anything going on?
I can't say anything about it. Every author with a big book that tells a long, complicated story and is kind of beloved, a certain segment of the population is looking to get their thing turned into a TV series, and so am I. But there's nothing at all concrete about it. It's just something that is, more than one person is interested in talking about it, but it's very far from being actual. But I think it would be a lot of fun if it happened. I always wanted to write films, but nope, nothing on that. And as you can see by looking at it, Ka will never be made into a movie. I sure hope, anyway. Unless, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. The trouble with CGI crows is that you'd have to give them facial expressions. And whatever Dar Oakley can see in another crow's eyes and faces and gestures and so on, they don't have they're pretty inflexible faces. so I don't know how you'd do it. But, if anybody wants to try.
Yeah, it would have to be a very, an avant-garde filmmaker with, a $500 million budget or something. And
right, one of them.
A studio who's really into crow sex and crows eating people and babies.
Right. Yep. That really hasn't. I haven't read a review yet that is turned off by all the dead people eating.
so far. Nobody said, "Oh, what a wonderful book," except all that icky dead people eating. Nobody said that. We'll see how it goes on.
All right, great. So I think we'll wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with John Crowley. And again, this new book is called Dar Oakley in the Ruins of Emer. So John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to John Crowley for joining us on the show. And as promised, here are the titles and authors of some of the books that John read while researching Ka. So we've got The Dominion of the Dead by Robert Pogue Harrison, This Republic of Suffering by Drew Gilpin Faust, Body and Soul by Robert Cox, The Celtic Heritage by Alwyn and Brindley Reese, Ravens in Winter and The Mind of the Raven by Bernd Heinrich, and In the Company of Crows and Ravens by John M. Marsleff and Tony Angel. So definitely go check those out. I also want to give a big thank you to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Ale Irene in Mexico and PJ Ropp and Kaluru in the US. Ale Irene writes, "This is an amazing podcast to get to know more about today's authors and personalities. I get a lot of ideas for books to read and series to watch. Thanks. Greetings from Monterrey, Mexico." So big thanks again to Ale Irene for that great review. Special thanks as well to Holly Snowden, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.